Thank you for joining us in the Prosperity and Peace track. We're going to start with a panel that I'm personally very excited about as a former government staffer in the Bloomberg administration. It's called Turning to Data to Build Cities That Work for All. And so we're honored to be joined here by Mayor Nan Whaley from Dayton, Ohio, Arturo Franco, Vice President of Data and Insights at Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, Dr. Michelle Thompson, Data Fellow and Associate Professor at the University of New Orleans in the Department of Planning and Urban Studies, and our moderator, Zach Markovits, who's the Director of City Progress with Works Cities. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you all for being here in the packed room. This is great. I'm Zach Markovits. I'm the Director of City Progress for Works Cities at Results for America. Results for America, we work with government at all levels to help them better use data to drive decision making and improve the lives of residents. I'm excited to be sitting with these colleagues at these couches to talk about something that's really important.
There it is.
In Works Cities, we've worked with over 150 cities around the country to imbue data and evidence into the decision making that mayors, like Mayor Whaley, and city managers, city councils need to use every single day. The sort of genesis of this panel is we've been thinking through what's critically important, and as we try and address some of the most intractable problems facing this country and this globe, sort of want to set the stage a little bit before I introduce the panel about why we're here. So there's an increasing number of people who live in cities across the globe. Many of you know this, about 55% of the global population is currently living in cities, looking to go up to around 70% by 2050. In the United States, even more stark, about 80% in the United States, going up to probably 90% by the 2050. And as we're looking at cities, we're finding that place matters more than ever. More than 14 million Americans live in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And in some areas of the United States, in cities, we see that life expectancy can differ by as much as 20 years from 5 miles down the road. Recent research from Raj Chetty and the folks at Opportunity Insights have just showed even more how much place really matters when we're looking at cities and efforts in our backyard. We find that long-term opportunity for individuals, people at the bottom 20% of society, it can vary drastically, again, by which side of the street you live on census tract levels. Meaning that in those neighborhoods of concentrated poverty that we see in the United States, that depending on which side of the street you're born on can make a major difference in your likelihood to achieve the American dream, to make more money than your parents, something that we've seen declining across the United States. In 1940s, a child born had about a 90% chance of making more than their parents, and that's about a coin flip today. So data information is crucial to our ability to tackle and bridge the income and opportunity gap. In cities, we're talking, as I mentioned before, mayors and city managers, city council, but also like lowercase c cities. The philanthropic groups in their backyard, businesses, and anchor academic institutions are critical to sort of working together to think about how we can solve these major and intractable challenges. And when we're talking today with my colleagues on these couches, I want to think about how leaders can drive economic mobility and inclusive growth in cities across the country that are about making decisions using the data that we're collecting every single day. So I'm excited to be joined by these 3 other leaders to talk about their mindsets, the tools, and what they have done to address some really, really critical challenges in their and all of our communities. Some core focuses of today's discussion. Want to think about how cities and community partners are able to work together to use data to address declining economic mobility, to ensure equality and equity when it comes to services and service delivery, address issues about the historical and structural inequities facing residents in our communities today, and then move from this intuition-based decision making to ones that are about insights driven by the data that we're collecting. So, my colleagues on these couches. Mayor Nan Whaley, directly to my left, the mayor of Dayton, Ohio. She was first elected to the Dayton City Council in 2005, I think is the youngest woman ever elected to the city commission. And she was elected as Dayton's mayor in 2013 by a double-digit majority and was the first mayor ever to be reelected without an opponent. If that's correct.
Correct. Yeah.
So pretty impressive. And is focused on a lot of really critical areas. We've been excited at Works Cities to work with her and her team, and has been focused pretty heavily on community development, manufacturing, and women and children. Arturo Franco, the Vice President of Data Insights at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Arturo is a development economist and strategy consultant, and before joining Mastercard was a senior advisor at McKinsey & Company's Global Public and Social Policy Practice, and the Executive Director of the Planning Council for the State of Nuevo León, where you also serve as the Undersecretary, right? He has also been a global leadership fellow for Latin America at the WEF, an economics research professor at Harvard's Center for International Development, and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Michelle Thompson, the furthest away from me, is the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth Data Fellow from New Orleans and an assistant professor at the University of New Orleans. And in the Department of Planning and Urban Studies. She teaches courses in geographic information systems, in community development, housing, urban studies, and land use. And her research focuses on the application of public participation geographic information systems in a community development, reinvestment, and revitalization. And I think, fun fact, she is this is just one of my favorite names of a website. She is the project manager of the web-based community mapping service, mapping information service, whodata.org.
Correct.
Did I pronounce that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's whodat. In
Whodat.
New Orleans, right?
Right. So
But it's
whodata.org.
whodata up
Whodata.
north, right? Okay.
Yeah, you got to mix the New Orleans and that, right. And it combines parcel-level neighborhood condition information with public data to monitor socioeconomic and demographic changes. So thank you to all for joining.
Thank you.
We're also hoping to make this a conversation and not just a series of questions. And so we're going to open this up to everybody towards the end of the panel today. So if you've got questions, please write them down, jot them. There will be an opportunity to ask them as we get towards the end. But to kick this off for everybody, I'd love to know, I laid out some pretty sobering facts in the beginning of this, the introductory remarks. And I'd love to know from you, what makes data so important in trying to tackle these challenges and developing and executing and measuring specific programs that help to address economic mobility and help to promote inclusive growth? Maybe I can start with you, Mayor, and then go down the line this way.
Well, I think what's so important about data and how much data we now have, we can really see if something is you have your intuition, but data helps decide, frankly, if that's really true. And I'll give you one example. It's no secret that on August 4th, Dayton experienced a mass shooting in our Oregon district. And following that, there's been a large conversation around what to do around guns in our community and across the state and country. And so we've had a lot of people come forward and want to do, for example, a gun buyback program, which were very popular in the 80s and 90s. But data has shown that gun buyback programs actually are not successful in getting guns off the street. And so while it intuitively would be, well, we just need to do a gun buyback program, that would solve it, there's been tons of data to show that this isn't effective. What I think is exciting is when people come to the commission or come to me at City Hall and say, hey, we want to do a gun buyback program. I say, look, the data just doesn't show that that's really effective for what we want to do. I agree with what you're trying to do here, but whatever we're going to do, we're going to make sure that it's an effective policy that is driven in data. And the community actually responds back and says, okay, that makes sense. And I think that's a real change from 10 years ago around how data drives decisions, not just for elected officials, but for citizens. Citizens are really interested in what drives change and how data can affect it. And I think that's just one example in the past few weeks on how data can really drive the decisions that are made in City Hall, but also in neighborhoods and across the country.
Thank you, that's great. Arturo?
Yeah, so you mentioned the income and opportunity gap, and so the Center for Inclusive Growth at Mastercard focuses on some of the key challenges faced by our communities, amongst them inequality of income and wealth. But there's another type of inequality affecting our cities, which is unequal access to information. And so what we're talking about here is, how do you level the playing field for cities to be able to use their own data to create the capacity to get to this, from intuition to kind of data-driven policy decisions. And so the word economist and exciting never go together in a sentence, but there has never really been a more exciting time to be an economist. The main enemy of economic and social progress for many years has been averages, because averages mask the reality of what happens in the histogram, and now we know that even if the average is going in the right direction, the 10% on one side or the 10% on the other side can kidnap the whole policy agenda, right? So we need to move beyond averages, and I think that's what a data-driven approach helps us to do mostly. And I can talk about why I'm excited as an economist, but I think we'll see something from Michelle Thompson today.
Well, and just to add on to your point about, I think that, my data folks in City Hall will always say, if Bill Gates walks in the room, we're all millionaires, but we're not really millionaires. And so really getting more detailed in this data really affects our communities as we see this this issue around economic mobility and also how extreme people are getting. That doesn't really help us in the average.
Unless he gives everyone else his money.
Yeah, if he gives us our money, then we're all for that, right.
And I'm going to be talking shortly about some specific insights, but what really has, why data is important, and it has been important for me for a long time, is before, I was going to say in the 80s, don't tell me how old you are, but in the early 90s as a licensed real estate appraiser before I came to the university, I was able to work in communities in Boston and other areas where there wasn't a lot of data about the transactions in terms of mortgages. And because the community didn't have the data, that was my goal, was to democratize the data, to get the data in any way so that people could make better decisions. So, when it was 48633 computers to desktops, the span in between, there's still a gap, and that's what has been really important to me, and that's why I want to make sure that what we do going forward, we bring the data back to the community so they can make the decisions, and we can couple that with insights that you'll see in a few moments. It's pretty exciting to see that we're heading in that direction.
Yeah. Can I just pick on just one piece of that? Because
Certainly.
you talk, that what you said there I think is really important, but there's also this element of how do you intersect the community with a city, with public agencies, with, New Orleans, it's the county, or whatever the case may be, the parish. Like, how do you think about that intersection and making sure that the community is able to play well with city, that corporations can be kind of like data philanthropists in their own way, as you guys have talked about? And you are on the front lines where policy and data intersect. So I'd love you to talk a little bit more about like how you make that possible.
Well, I usually say, I have a lot of free labor, which are called students at the university. And I think that's where going from private sector and being a real estate appraiser, going into the university and bringing that into the classroom. So the idea of using geographic information systems or computer mapping to take students and teach them the technology, work with community organizations and ask, what is it that you need? Collect the data, put it together in a way that it can be used, left with the community, so that when we come back to university, we can study to see if it worked, but the community has what it needs. And in terms of municipal government, New Orleans has come a long way, but it didn't at the start even have the parcel layer information that we needed. So things changed over time where we could come together and make sure the way we're collecting data really intersects and matches and overlays with what the community needs, the government needs, so that we're all talking the same language.
Yeah, it's so interesting. New Orleans is one of 13 cities that had received Works Cities certification, which is the first ever sort of national standard of what great looks like for municipal governments using data most effectively. And it's interesting because they've kind of carried over from a Landrieu administration into a Cantrell. So different priorities, like different outcomes, but that kind of capacity within the city to do it and to work with neighborhoods really effectively, it's very different mayors, very different sort of, but that putting that in and making that priority is really, I don't know if you've seen that manifested on the ground anywhere in the city or anything that you've been doing there.
Well, one of the things that changed for New Orleans is, especially after Katrina, which was 2005, is that when it came time to come in, to develop a new comprehensive land use plan, they mandated in the plan that community engagement was required by force of law. So I haven't heard that, and again, Mayor, you might know from since you're with the council, I haven't really heard that in many other cities where at the community level there's a requirement to talk to community before big decisions are made. And I'm not really sure, but I think that made a difference in terms of making sure there was forced collaboration in a positive way.
It's really interesting. Mayor, I'd love to go back to something that you had mentioned briefly, and when you brought up and I think we're all familiar with the series of tragedies that have fallen the city of Dayton and the region in general. And you brought up something that I think is really important as you think about the long-term strategy that you see for the city of Dayton. That requires a lot of effort and planning. And then you have these interruptions that happen along the way that require your entire community to galvanize and come together. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about how you either set yourself up for that, how data becomes a role in both setting priorities and meeting the goals that you're trying to achieve, both as mayor, while at the same time getting your community sort of come together and attack the sort of more immediate problems.
Right. I mean, it's difficult, right, to have long-term plans and then tornadoes and shootings come your way. And I think that's one of the challenges that makes, I think, cities so interesting and so resilient in the way they work, because all cities have crises every single day. And the real work of leadership is to say, yeah, I'm going to work with these issues, but then I've got to keep my eye on the ball for something 10 years down the road that I'm probably not even going to be sitting in this seat to see. And I think one key is, for example, we've done a lot of investment, and we work with Works Cities around high-quality universal pre-K, right? That we passed as a ballot initiative as an income tax, where actually suburban folks pay for inner-city kids to go to preschool, which I love because it's also like one of the most progressive tax policies around. And but have done that and then instituted a group of people that's their job every day, right? So they when tornadoes or other shootings, other things that happen every day in our community, they're not off the ball. They'll help, of course, everyone digs in when these kind of tragedies happen to your community, but it's institutionalized that they're working and they're collecting the data and they're reporting out every year, and there's a system for us to see how we're doing. I think that's really important because it's not, a lot of times the mayor's or the mayor's office gets all the attention, but it really isn't us, right? It's the systems that have been put in place to make sure that the leader there is driving that and checking back in to the elected or appointed leadership that's working that. And I think that's what's so important as you kind of build these frameworks for cities, that you have someone really holding on to those long-term strategic plans.
Yeah. Could you go more into that actually partnership that you have done with on that early childhood with Preschool Promise? And so you on two sides, I'd love you to talk about it. One is why prioritize early childhood education as a tool to address economic mobility as opposed to other areas.
Sure.
And then the second thing is, I'd love you to talk about how you use data to create positive pressure in the community to pass a new levy, right? That helped to build out sustained funding for a model that the data had shown that you believed in. Right.
So I think first, I got involved. I mean, I came into the economic mobility space kind of backwards through education. And Dayton has a high poverty rate. 98% of our children are below the poverty level in the city of Dayton. So all of our kids are poor. And, really thought that we needed to be paying attention to investment for their success, not just in the school. But, when I became mayor, this was a bigger discussion about like after school and summer programming, mentorship, all the data showing, 65% of the children's aptitude really comes from when they're not in school. So what are communities doing about that? And it's not necessarily about in the schoolhouse. And so that data was kind of flowing around. And preschool seemed to be just a real natural place that you could see great rewards for getting kids ready for kindergarten, which most of our kids weren't ready when they went to kindergarten. And you could see that make a big difference. And quite frankly, it's not very expensive. And so for a poor city, that's a great place for us to go. And so there was opportunity there because you could see that the data showed from other cities that have done this, that preschool and getting kids ready for kindergarten has great effects. Secondly, if we invested in this would be something that could galvanize the community. Third, I thought the way that we should do it, other cities have done it in different ways, but the income tax model for the way the state of Ohio works could help us really drive dollars that we couldn't get any other way for young people, and so and particularly 4-year-olds. And then we wanted to study it. We made it a temporary tax. So it's an 8-year tax that was passed in 2016, because then those children would be third graders by the time we could really see how what moves. Like, because I said to the citizens of Dayton, look, I'm asking you to pass this. I'm not saying it's forever. We're going to see how we go, so that way we can be held accountable to you. And we have been very dogged in that, like with to make sure that our research and is constant to make sure we can see how kids do as we follow them from the age of 4 all the way through K through 12, and getting them their first fair start. And because preschool is still a new idea in a lot of places, we could really show that over the 8 years. So I think that's what's really important. So that allowed the business community to say, okay, we're not just giving this carte blanche tax. We get to see the results, and then hold the effort accountable. Now, the other thing we did was the Preschool Promise. We want it to go countywide. So there's 16 other jurisdictions in our county, and so Dayton going in actually then encouraged other communities to start going as well. And that's really the goal, because then we're not the only place that hold children of poverty. Where else can we get this movement? And that has now, I think we've moved up to 5 jurisdictions because of Dayton's investment. So it was a way for us to give something for our community, but then also lead for other communities to move in our region.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And the ability to actually drive that change, not just in your community, but with partners outside in the county, that is a political.
Very hard.
It's
very difficult.
Yeah, and so then anybody here has worked with cities and with mayors, and that is unusual to actually have that happen.
And that's not me. I mean, I think that we had this group called Learn to Earn, which is the collective impact model that really works at like preschool readiness, 3rd grade reading, 9th to 10th grade transition, high school graduation, college completion or credential, right? The pieces of the collective impact. They had been doing this work and laying the groundwork, and so that really helped us be able to plug in. And then, and the politics are still hard, but, because you have the support of a collective impact model where everybody's in line, how can you really be against it as a leader? That really helped.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Arturo, I just want to turn to you. I would love to know a little bit more about the Mastercard's kind of Data Fellows program and how from that side, or how has it helped cities integrate more kind of data-based and data-oriented thinking into the policy and decision-making process? And then I'd love to know what kind of impact and results you have seen either in New Orleans or actually in any of the cities that you guys are investing in as you've begun to go through this over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so 1 year ago in this same venue, we launched the first generation of data fellows, of which Michelle is part of. And the idea was to take data scientists or people who are doing innovative analytics and asking the question, what can they do if we give them access to our very rich, granular, and timely transaction data, our anonymized and aggregated spend data, and what can they tell cities about themselves, about their neighborhoods, about the stories of different pockets of the city that they haven't seen before. And it's been a great journey, and we'll keep doing that. But we're also moving into kind of from one of 2 platforms, right? So we have been working on a few partnerships, one of which Mayor Whaley is part of, which is the Accelerator for America, a peer-to-peer network of mayors that are sharing practices. There's so much innovation happening from the bottom up in cities. And so we are trying to support places where mayors can learn from each other and can try to adapt the same tools. And to answer, I guess, your second question, I mean, there are many stories, quotes that I gotten throughout the year. For example, people in Erie, Pennsylvania, a place that has been very kind of aggressive in the opportunity zone, in trying to bring investment back to one of the poorest zip codes in all of the U.S., to a place that lost 40% or so of its population, that's had negative job growth for the last decade. And it's coming, it's a transformation story. And they said, when we see the data, we know that the purchasing power is there. When we see the data, we know that the potential is there, and it brings a 20-year plan down to a 5-year plan. And so saving 15 years of a community is something that I would say is priceless, but just because I work at it.
Well done.
Yes. Yes.
Had to.
That's great.
Fantastic. Good way to get the talking points in there. So, well, actually, so for last year on this event, your colleague, Shamina Singh, the president of Mastercard's Center for Inclusive Growth, talked about how she views data philanthropy as the best path forward to ensure leaders can impact economic growth and this idea of inclusive growth and make sure that they're set up for success. I love this idea of data philanthropy, but I think it actually could be sort of misinterpreted in many different ways. I'd love if you could maybe define what that means for people here, and then tell us about what that, since the conversation a year ago, what that road has looked like over the past 12 months, and where you have seen sort of new steps in this like data philanthropy space, and where you're encouraged, where we should all be looking or be encouraging our communities to be diving deeper into.
So let me start. So data philanthropy, our approach and our commitment to it goes beyond just the data. We have many other things that we can put on the table as a company. We have technology, we have talent, skills, experience, 500 data scientists, et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we look at the public sector, particularly at the local level, mid to small size cities, when we look at the social sector, we see that there is a growing gap between the tools, frameworks, and the technology that the private sector is using, the impact that data science and AI and machine learning is having there versus the impact that it could be having in the social sector and the public sector, but it's not being picked up. Part of it has to do with kind of basic awareness, so we're working through platforms to make the leaders more aware of the power of data science. But a big part of it has to do with talent. So, I mean, I would ask here, how many of you are data scientists or work in analytics? Raise your hand if you're a data scientist. Okay. How many of you have applied for a job in a mid-sized city to be the the data officer there?
Wow.
So exactly what I mean about that. 2 out of
2.
I don't
know.
Somebody was counting. I'm not good at I'm not good at data, but I think it's like 80 and then 2. So that's a big issue. How do you create the incentives and the stories that will make this a career choice for people who are data scientists. So we're working in kind of all of these fronts. And as we look at the future, I think we would like to see more private sector companies, while doing data privacy by design and kind of sharing our principles of what good data governance is, which is essential. Kind of jumping into the space and being a little bit more, kind of aggressive in trying to narrow this gap, in trying to increase and accelerate the adoption of data science in sectors where it's not happening right now.
It's so fascinating, and at what Works Cities is something we've been doing a lot on the other side, right? Working with organizations like the city of Dayton or the city of New Orleans and other 150 other cities around the country on that public sector side. How do we ensure that city governments have the tools and the resources to work collaboratively with their corporate community, with the nonprofit community, with their academic institutions, so that data can be made into decision making from a collective way. I hope that next year when we're here, that number of hands around the room will go up, because I will say, and just to be like a little shill for mid-sized cities, the need is there and the excitement is there, and the ability to actually drive change in your backyard is almost endless if you're able to do that. I mean, actually, I would love to know your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think I'm so grateful this conversation is happening in New York City, because it normally doesn't happen in New York City. It's usually a conversation in the mid-sized cities across the country. But absolutely, I mean, that's one of the big challenges, particularly on this data front for mid-sized cities, is we don't have a lot of the talent in this effort. It's mostly sorted by the coast and in large cities. So, public service and public sector service in getting data analysis in our communities is a really big deal. And I think you're right. You can make an immense amount of change if you choose to go into these mid-sized cities, and your ideas and thoughts are super valued. Also, it's way cheaper to live where I live. So your dollar goes a long way. So so I appreciate the plug for these communities and ways that you can really make a difference and show just great, tremendous impact. And if that's what you're in for, I think you should check out a mid-sized city.
And it's been so interesting because in Works Cities, we've been working with Dayton and New Orleans and 8 other cities on this small cohort of cities. who are actively working to address economic mobility challenges in their backyard through programs like Preschool Promise or through workforce programs happening in New Orleans. And so if you were looking to sort of narrow it down, you can look at these 10 who are trying to attack economic mobility at their root, because it's something that I think everyone's really trying to focus on. Actually, this may be a good point. I would love to know a little bit more about, because you can sort of bring it home to how this can manifest itself in a specific city.
Yes.
Talk a little about your work in New Orleans and where this has come to
So
to
I'm
work.
going to come over and start us off with just a brief overview of the work. And again, hopefully everyone can hear me. Can hear me in the corner there? Great. So I always start this with, as an associate professor at the university, I have to speak for 2 hours and 45 minutes. I've been given 5, okay? So forgive me for the fast talk and brief overview. But I'm so fortunate to have been selected to work with the center. It's not a plug, but it really is amazing that, I hope that other professors or other folks really take a look at ways of giving back. And that's something that I have, and I told you about my passion about trying to democratize data. So as the data fellow, I've worked very closely with Ed Lee. Ed, could you just stand up and please, you have to give him a round of applause because a data scientist working with someone who's linear and talks a little too much, but has great ideas. We've spent over 13 months trying to come up with ways to break through some of the issues and the concerns that we've talked about really at the surface. How do you get access to data that is private? How do you create a system internally and externally to bring someone from the outside who can really talk the language, work with the scientists, and then even today, this is really a monumental moment to take it outside and share it with the community, not just New Orleans, but across the country, in order to make sure that the data, that big data really makes sense on the ground. So this is just the really start of a conversation of what we've been working on. So here we are in the city of New Orleans. On the top right corner is the city of New Orleans, and this is a combined map. This map was really the boomerang outside in the core area here is what's known as a livable Claiborne corridor. The Claiborne Avenue runs from one end of the city to the other. And after 2005, there was an idea that the city was decimated. We know that story, but they wanted to develop a place-based corridor where they could really put together with all the combined neighborhoods, different resources, and try to see if there was a way to lift up this particular corridor together, looking at transportation, education. For this particular corridor, you can see a number of neighborhoods from Central City on the left-hand side to the lower 9th Ward, which I'm sure many are familiar with. So these neighborhoods individually, of course, have their different neighborhood plans. The city has their overall plan. But how do you collect all the information that's necessary to make a comprehensive plan to move this whole corridor and these neighborhoods forward? So the Livable Claiborne Corridor Initiative was developed. And part of this, and the goal of this, was to make sure that disaster community development funds, which came from FEMA, they were running out. What other ways can the city take the plan forward? And again, what's most important is with the cooperation, support, and really the vision of the community. The other part of this map are the orange call-outs. Those are the qualified opportunity zones. City of New Orleans has 25 zones. The state has 150. The 5 zones that we've highlighted here are really the start, again, of some early investigation on what did the zones look like. On the ground, what I did was last spring have a group of my students do a service learning project with Asali Ecclesiastes. If you stand up, Asali. And she's another partner. Please thank her. We'll talk about what Asali has done, but part of it was to try to get an understanding of what information is needed. So you'll see the yellow call out is the Interstate 10. In many cities across the country, the Federal Highway Administration, back in the 70s and thereabouts, decimated a number of communities by putting the highways through the areas where folks who couldn't fight back and say, I don't want this highway going through my neighborhood. But in New Orleans, in this particular neighborhood, Over 325 minority, primarily black-owned businesses were just wiped out, along with the second most collection of trees of North America, oak trees, sorry about that. So what happens with the LCC was the idea that, well, maybe what we should do is try to take down the interstate. After a $1 million study of this particular incentive, it was decided, no, we're not going to take down the interstate. So many cities across the country then said, well, how do we reimagine how to live underneath the interstate? So that's what happened. Asali Ecclesiastes, co-leader of the Claiborne Innovation District and then became the director, started with a number of community organizations. We did multiple meetings and then came up with a plan. Well, the federal government owns the land underneath the interstate. They provided the land to the city, and then the land control was there, but now they had to do some visioning. So part of the work that we did was to take this 19-block area, do a parcel-by-parcel community assessment, collect information, got census information, and that's great. And then where do we go from there? Well, that's part of what this whole project has been about, is that, as you can see on the horizontal axis, there's a lot of community data, census data that's available, but what we didn't have was the access to that Mastercard anonymized and aggregated data. So in March of 2019, over 60 data scientists over a 36-hour period and 1,000 hours of effort took this data, as you can imagine, 3 years of data, every, as I say, megasecond of transaction, so we can put our arms around it and try to figure out how can we analyze it in a way that makes sense and we can share it with cities. That's what was accomplished during the Datathon. And then Ed and I could move forward with figuring out what kind of information will be beneficial. So partners, NOLA Business Alliance and the Asali and the Mayor's Office, we started talking about where are some of the high priority areas that we should start diving into and looking at the data a bit closer. We're in the middle of that process now. But as you can see with Hoffman Triangle, now Holy Cross, which again is adjacent to Lower Ninth Ward, what we're able to see is while Holy Cross does still maintain lower income and also lower spend patterns, obviously it varies throughout these 25 qualified opportunity zones. New Orleans East, for example, also has lower income, but it has a higher level of spending pattern. So what this information can provide, and we're having conversations now, is the public policies that need to be developed are going to be customized, are going to have to be unique, and that's some of the resources that the center is going to be providing. This one is, and we have one more slide after this, is really exciting. Some of the data, again, I'm not able to see the individual businesses. That's part of, making sure that the data is secure. But what we were able to do is look at that corridor and try to see the new business openings. And of course, why is that important? If we have folks who are interested in investment locally or now with the qualified opportunity zones, businesses, investors need to figure out where is the action. And if these neighborhoods, which are typically cash-based economies, they can't show their purchasing power. We're adding to the conversation in the data. So in 2015, there were, in the livable Claiborne corridor, 175 new businesses. This is not cumulative. It's in 2016, 188. 217, 235, and 337 new businesses open in this corridor. And certainly we've been bringing the data up to date to 2019. Okay. And the last slide here, as we're trying to find different ways to cut the data and to provide it out to the community, we also are trying to look at it in different levels of geography, which is extremely important, and obviously over a time series. So what this is showing from 2015 to 2018, those horizontal white lines are monthly. I mean, the spending data is mind-boggling. So Arturo and Ed can speak to that, but the idea that to be able to have access to the information show that the CID, that yellow area, has grown 137% over a three-year period. That's information that's just not readily available, or available actually. The livable Claiborne corridor grew 16%, and New Orleans 11%. Essentially what this shows is that the public policy of trying to reimagine, create a tax incentive of that CID, it worked. The CID has now grown 12 times faster. So I think that the other cities, this is not just unique to New Orleans, can take this model, can collect this data, work collaboratively to talk to community, verify it on the ground. And my students, I have 18 students right now this semester who have adopted a zone and are going to put together a profile so we can take this data and move it forward. So we're going to continue the conversation over here.
Thank
And
you.
Ed, we have you.
So I want to ask one more question of the panelists, and then I'd like to open it up. So get your questions ready. So this is just to like sum up, and at least in this, and this is really helpful. I think I know your answer, but we'll start with you and come down.
Sure.
But I'd love to know, for cities who are not doing this already, who don't, or maybe are very like early on in their journey of using data effectively to like inform the policies and the processes, how would you suggest they start? Or the folks in this room, all of whom are leaving this room to apply for jobs in mid-sized cities, and so when they actually start their jobs, like what would you suggest that they do first?
Well, I mean, I have many hats on, right? So the first one certainly would be cities need to connect with their anchor institutions, their universities. It's not just the big universities, it's the community. There's many universities that are requiring students to do service learning. So you've got, folks who can be trained. This is a toolkit, there's a methodology to collecting the information, to be able to put it together and assemble it. This gives another add-on to their resume, which will be helpful when you're going to look for that extra job. And volunteerism is just important. So I think that, and all different types of levels, the experience of, and I want to mention on the data scientists, these were 60 data scientists from Mastercard that came, from around the country and volunteered their time. And I think there's something, even where you're at, in your corporation, that level of corporate responsibility, maybe that can extend to where you're at to come up with a project that maybe your corporation or your, where you're at can help. But it's the conversation with the community first and making sure you're not doing top down.
Great, thank you. Arturo?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Michelle's point on not doing top down, I think that there is definitely something happening in this country where cities are taking their future in their own hands. Maybe it's because Washington has kind of disappeared, or maybe it's because there's more data and capacity than ever before, but there still needs to be a lot of work done. And so what we have been trying to do is think about or imagine what the economic development toolkit of the future looks like. What are those frameworks? What are those tools? So we're working, for example, with Brookings on a similar type of kind of database to tell cities which industries could grow in their cities using economic complexity theory and stuff that I'm not going to bore you with. We have data fellows working on how do you find kind of good jobs for low mobility, low income workers using a data-driven approach. So I think once we start putting all of these things together, I dream with a dashboard that Mayor Whaley can log into and gives her all of these exciting maps and the data is not just ACS data and she has to wait a year to like reload the map, but that the private sector and others are contributing in a safe way data that will allow this to come to life, right? And so that's really the vision that we're working towards.
Thank you.
I think this is very exciting to get some of this private sector data into the public sector sphere, and it's something that companies can do. It takes a lot of work, frankly, for Mastercard to do this, and we appreciate it, but it can make a big difference in communities, especially as you consider what's happening in our communities and the disruption of retail, right? Particularly, there's two kinds of development. Like the city of Dayton, for example, never invests in retail because we feel it is a place that follows real job creation, particularly around manufacturing and advanced manufacturing, because that's the way to spin off money. But the retail is something that does affect quality of life and community, and so it does have a role. And in that disruption, getting as much data as possible is going to be really important when we start creating neighborhoods and recreating neighborhoods that have less retail options. And what does that mean, and how does that make the community look? These are real questions affecting neighborhoods. So,
Great. So I'd love to. How much time is left on this? 0 time left? Can we have one question?
okay,
Yeah.
one question.
Okay. Well, let's. I have a very enthusiastic hand right in front of us, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Thanks. So my name's Alexander. I'd like to ask
Oh,
about
there's
trust.
a.
So I'd like to ask about trust. And too often we talk about trust only when it's already broken. And so as cities are really embarking on their city journey, how do we build trust in at the very beginning?
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
Please.
No, go ahead. No.
Oh, I want to say that's one of the reasons why Asali Ecclesiastes is here, and I want to say going to add Lee. So you've got someone in the big data corner, we got someone in the community. You need to have a bridge. I'm not saying I'm the only bridge. I'm just saying that you have to be able to look and talk and listen to folks who are in the community and making sure that they're brought to the table and listened to, and then the data science is brought together, and then making sure that you give something back that can be used. And that's what builds the trust, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would just add, I think that's really important. There's this whole idea of open source data and raw data that the community can share, but that's a very small percentage of your community, right? Yeah. That's important, but it's also to show the data in a way that anybody can use and can see, and as transparent as possible. And so we've tried to do that on the front end in Dayton, so people can look and see, and it can be done in a way that they can actually ingest the data, right? Because if not, it's not very useful for the public trust building. And on all of these issues around transparency in government and the connection to government to people, I always say this relationship, whether it's community police relations, relationship with the schools, it's a marriage with the community. And so it is never done. It is never figured out. It is a daily action. And just like you work on your relationship with your partner, communities have to work that relationship with their citizens. And if we think of it that way, we never stop doing it. And I think that's how trust continues to build then.
Yeah, so and just to build on that, I think it's such a good point, is we have been looking with cities and what works cities across the country. One of the things we measure when we look at this what works cities assessment, which is in essence like a data checkup for the city, like how do they do this work, is about stakeholder engagement. So it's not just do you open your data up to the public, which is important and one piece of it, but it's also about do you actively reach back into the community, not just to the data leads who are going to ultimately use your open data and help to build the critical aspects, but do you reach back into the community organizations that ultimately need to understand what's happening to start a conversation and not just push and sort of push outward and downward. I wish we could have more of this. I didn't realize that we were running out of time. It's a great conversation. I want you to join me with thanking everybody else on this stage, and we'll be around to answer any questions from you.